and welcome to Diverse and Inclusive Leaders. This is the show where I speak with the most inspirational and thought-provoking leaders of today and unearth their unique stories of diversity and inclusion to help inspire, educate and motivate others to make the world a better place. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Tom Fiennes. Tom is the Commercial Sustainability Director at Britvic PLC. He's had a wealth of superb experience within the FMCG arena and has over 20 years worth of program, sales, commercial experience within blue chip organizations. He's responsible for delivering the GB Healthy People, Healthy Planet strategy, whilst also developing a culture and delivering large-scale transformation projects and activities. In addition, he also leads the Britvic Be Proud network, which looks after the interests and drives positive change when it comes to the LGBTQ plus community. Welcome to the show, Tom.
All right, Leila, that's a heck of an introduction. Thank you.
And a very well-deserved one, to be quite honest, Tom.
I also read it out.
But tell me, Tom, for those who obviously don't know you as well as I do, and some of my wonderful team obviously have the privilege of knowing you well additionally. But tell us, and for our listeners, a little bit about how you came to be where you are today in the senior role that you're in, and some of the experiences you've had on the career and personal journey to date.
Oh, where to start? So, I'm pleased to say to start with that those two journeys are actually symbiotic. So what's happened in my personal life and what's happened in my professional life have actually at one point converged to get me to where I am today. So I think it's important for your watchers and listeners to understand that I have essentially grown up and lived my life as a straight, white, what is now middle-aged man, obviously not always middle-aged, but so I've grown up with very much feeling that I'm part of the majority as opposed to minority, and I've had the pleasure or the displeasure of understanding what that looks like and feels like from talking with straight friends in society and growing up. I have 3 children, for example. So I was married and have 3 children, whereas I actually started dealing with my sexuality very late in life. And there's lots of complex reasons that sit behind why it happened late in life. But I don't think it's valuable to go into that today. The point is I didn't either look into it or come to terms with it until that journey started about 8 years ago. I came out about 5 years ago now, and I came out to, at the time, my wife and my children, which was very difficult, especially for my wife at the time. Not so challenging for my children, depending on the ages that they're at. Actually, one of them was actually really quite happy to find out that I was gay. They were very excited about that. Less excited about the fact that I needed to move out and change the shape of the family. So I've really gone from that one side of living and how I see myself into evaluating that and then essentially changing my life wholesale. And I think it's going through that experience, and it was a traumatic experience because it was traumatic for not just for me, but also for the people that I loved the most on this planet, and then had to face into those conversations with those people and essentially change their paradigm of how they saw me. So it truly was a coming out experience. For some other people, including my partner, it was a very simple, relatively easy thing that happened at a young age, which I'm pleased to say happens more and more these days. And to your question, I changed in the workplace at the time because there was a couple of things that happened that I noticed very early on. The first was that as I went through my own crisis and went through that experience, I started to dramatically reduce the hours that I worked because I had to spend that time focusing on the situation, my family, and ensuring that I could try and control the damage as best I could at the time. And as I was going into work, 2 things happened. The first is no one seemed to notice I was going through any trauma at the time anyway. So either I was showing up differently and not showing people what I was going through, which made it harder for me. But also it had very little impact on how people saw me showing up. In other words, the amount of work that I used to do to prepare for meetings would be absolutely ridiculous. And then when I went through this period of dialing it down, I was turning up and I was still able to do those meetings without having to have done all that work. So it gave me a real eye-opener to actually, how do you spend your time effectively, and what do you really need to do, and what do you need to worry about and focus on, versus what can you actually rest on your experience, your knowledge, to be able to bring that to the parties that were on a day-to-day basis. And that's what made me very, very interested in how people show up at work, which is why I now champion bringing your true self to work at Britvic. And it's why I mentor inside Britvic and outside of Britvic. And it's why I seem to be quite acute to when people change slightly, those small things, the small differences that you can see, that mean actually maybe they're signs that people are going through things outside of work that can impact how they show up at work. And to be there as a support, to be there as a guide, and sometimes just to be there as an ear in the workplace can have a huge amount of value. Does that answer your first question? I feel like I've spoken for ages.
You absolutely haven't. It has been fascinating, and you have answered the question. I've almost forgotten what the question is now, to be quite honest with you, because you've answered it in abundance and with true authenticity. And so, first of all, I must say thank you so very much for sharing. What is really a very, very personal story indeed. And what's particularly interesting is you mentioned there straight away a number of different facets of diversity and inclusion, and the fact that you've also had this opportunity, if that is the right word, to view life through another lens as well before then, obviously coming out. And I'm sure that had, many kind of conflicts in your mind and, those difficulties, which of course exist below the surface. And, when we talk about diversity, inclusion and belonging and equality and all of these great things, there still is this perception that must be, one thing or two things or something like that. In true reality, as you've just described in that short synopsis, there are a number of pieces here at play, and they sit invisibly. And so if you didn't know, visibly, and you didn't ask, then you would potentially never know. So it's
absolutely.
It's curious, to hear, almost the different layered facets of the wider repercussions almost that this can have, both personally and professionally.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I said there were two things earlier, but when I went through the experience, I didn't realize it beforehand, which even now is still the lion's share of my career. But all of that time, because I was subconsciously wrestling with things or not facing into things, I was showing up differently. I wasn't being my true self. It wasn't until I came out at work, which was a year after I came out to my closest friends and family. So that's a whole year of knowing that I'm dealing with it and trying to deal with the consequences, that I then started showing up at work differently. And it wasn't until I showed up at work differently that I started to enjoy the success that I had always wanted to have. And I think it's inherently built into that level of confidence that you have as an individual, that sense of self-worth that you have, that allows you to be able to speak your mind and show up differently in order to get different results. So it's weird when you stop chasing what you're looking for and you actually just turn up authentically, then it starts to happen for you by default. So I think there's a lot to be said for that. And just going back on another thing that you've just said, so there's two interesting things. I work with people of my age or similar generations who are also going through a similar experience that I went through. So it's interesting when you put your story out there, how many people magnetize towards you to then talk about, okay, what's happened. In some cases, these are conversations that they've never had with anyone else on the planet, but they're starting to have it because you've signposted that you're available to be spoken to and it's confidential and so on. So it's really interesting to understand there's still loads of people that go through that I say exercise, but go through that process later on in life. And then conversely, there's still people young who experience as they go through school, the slurs and the slander and the bullying that can be associated with being called gay. Even for people that aren't, it creates this environment where you can grow up with a lack of self-worth, which then impacts the rest of your life in all the decisions that you make.
I love that you mentioned there this almost snowball or magnetic effect, as you described it, in that, really the power of storytelling and sharing and really putting ourselves out there in often a vulnerable way can have such a profound difference, not only to us, but also to others, as you say, who are experiencing this. And, I guess when you look at the wider population, friends, family, colleagues, it could be any one of us. And when I say that, I don't mean it in a negative way. I mean, actually, it could be something that any one of us could, at some point in our lives, go through that change. And so, without speaking about it and without, really kind of putting ourselves out there, it's very difficult for others to then understand, truly until they hear it from someone else and almost kind of contextualize, what those feelings could mean, because we're all humans, at the end of the day. We all, living, sleeping, breathing, emotions, heart, soul, etc.
Yeah.
It's hard to sometimes even pinpoint or put into words some of the feelings that we have below the surface. And so commend you for really kind of putting yourself out there and for talking about it, because it's no easy task. And I imagine, when you mention some of the challenges there, some of the almost like the guilt that you probably wrestle with, the personality juxtapositions between all of what that means is, it probably led you to many sleepless nights, I would imagine.
Well, so there's a number of things that you just talked about. One of which is, for me, the leadership piece is vulnerability. I have a belief that there's a very strong correlation to be able to put yourself out there and be vulnerable to be able to lead. I think is a really, really important trait. I'm also really conscious now of anything that I'm doing in work that involves multiple people. I always approach it as with the view that there's stuff going on in people's lives, and whether that be an LGBT stuff, whether it be to do with ethnicity or gender, or even just tough times at home. People have challenges. I mean, Lord knows that this year especially has been one where so many people have been finding things really tough for lots of different reasons. So I think approaching those situations with that in the back of your mind, that what you say has an impact on people, is really, really important. Sorry.
I'd love to dive deeper into that. I think the words that you used around self-worth and leadership and vulnerability, all of that is so profoundly true. But you also mentioned there, some of the language, I guess, that is used, with potentially even in the schoolyard, with those younger generations. The reason why some of these negative connotations can feed into kind of personal, professional life, and whether they be I didn't mean it like that, or that they're not meant in a vicious way, they can still have that impact. And so, it's great that you mentioned earlier in our conversation that your children and your family have been supportive, and one of your children in particular. But I just wonder, your take, having 3 children, being a father as well, your thoughts around what happens in those younger years, because a flippant comment almost, is that the root cause systemically, in the same way that it is often with racism and such, that leads us to this place where suddenly people are fearful to come out?
Yeah, I think it's still very live today as it was decades ago, in as much as being able to call someone a gay, or you're behaving so gay, and all that sort of stuff that takes place in the schoolyard is still quite prevalent. That's my understanding from the research and the books and so on that I read. And there are so many other elements of D&I, that spectrum, where it would be entirely unacceptable, where both teachers, parents, and in some cases other kids would not stand for some of that language being used. So racism is a great example. We know there's a long way to go on racism. I'm not saying that that's not the case as well. And I'm not saying this is competitive between different parts of D&I. So I also sit on the D&I steer code, which covers all elements of D&I, not just LGBT. And I think that it's a really good example of where something can be said at school. Whereas if you're there and you feel different, and then someone's calling you out as being different, or calling someone else out as being different, but you know that probably affects you and is just as relevant for you as it is to the other person, that actually that stays with you. That stays with you throughout your life, because you feel different and it reduces your feeling of self-worth. And even when you look at some of those other D&I characteristics, if you look at race as an example, you are likely to be able to go home to a family that loves you, that is of the same race, and will talk to you about, actually, this is what racism is like out there, and this is how you need to protect yourself, and this is what you need to expect, and this is how you need to respond. But there's a sense of love and foundation there that is really, really important. Of course, a lot of people that are trying to understand sexuality, especially at school age, they're not having those conversations with their parents, or in a lot of cases, they're not having those conversations with their parents. Sometimes parents don't think they need to have that conversation because it's not something that they consider their children are going to end up being anyway. So when you're surrounded by that environment where it's still a slur, is used as a slur and a negative connotation, and you're sitting there trying to struggle with that yourself, you are naturally going to grow up feeling that you are different and that you are less worthy and therefore have less self-worth. And I do talk to a lot of people later on, more mature years, who will still reference, they hold on to those experiences as kids that significantly impact how they show up even here today.
There's so many rich points that we could go really, really deep on there in what you said, but I'll pick up on a couple here. In particular, the one around, diversity, and this is not one against the other. I think that's such an important point to mention. This is not a zero-sum game, situation. Additionally, on top of that, it could be that an individual is also LGBTQ plus and also would relate to some of those other facets. Absolutely. Which again, brings about, even more challenges. But it is so true that, again, my experience is I am not a parent yet, other than I do have 2 fur babies, but I don't have babies yet. But when you kind of recall times in the playground, or when you've been growing up and people will kind of flippantly use, or children will use flippantly, the terminology of, kind of gay, or gay this, gay that, I think it is perceived as a far softer, almost
playful.
Yeah, playful. Yeah, so it's a playful thing. It can be said in jest. It can almost even be said in a funny, in inverted commas, kind of way. To then call out a child in the playground and call them a X, Y, Z relating to the color of their skin, or in my case, I had it with kind of my eyes being Chinese. Yeah. It seems to be something which is much more shocking, and much more detrimental. I absolutely concur with that. And, ultimately, equally, I'm not saying both are the same, because they absolutely aren't. And I don't have the lived experience of being LGBTQ plus, but the impact it can have, as you say, in later life can be profound. And I'm sure, if we looked at, kind of bigger, wider statistics of those who have now come out, recalling those moments, as you said, in younger life when someone had said something, that they probably would have come out much earlier had there have not been this fear, associated with negative connotations.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's not always the case that people don't come out earlier out of fear because of those negative connotations. Sometimes people, it's almost subliminal in its effect on people as they grow up. Also, sexuality is not a black and white scale. It is definitely a lot of grey, and the majority of grey that sits in the middle. So having the space, the time, and the confidence to explore who you are and what that means to you is, I think, the bits that's missing. And unfortunately, that happens in your formative years when you're younger, which happens when you tend to be in those environments where it seems to be the last bastion of being able to say things that, as you say, might be considered funny, or gain a sense of humour. It's just a joke, all that sort of stuff that feels quite light.
And on the point of language as well, of course, it is LGBTQ plus or LGBTQ plus I and various other shortened versions depending on where you are in the world. But you're absolutely right. There is not a black and white scenario when it comes to being almost out or not. And I think probably, and again, do correct me if I'm wrong, probably, this is a lot to do with the era in which we were brought up with, as well, and in which, the legal laws and legislations, I think, a lot of the time, especially probably some of our younger leaders wouldn't remember a time where it was actually illegal. I mean, these are such historic moments that thankfully, a lot of countries have now passed. But it is so deep rooted, isn't it? And
it is. There's still more. There are far too many countries out there. I know that sounds a bit judgy, but I come from a place of judgment here, that are where it is illegal, where you can be beaten up in the streets, quite easily and without recourse if you are LGBT plus, etc. So there's still quite a big piece of action that needs to take place globally to get everyone to the same place. But also, my kids, it's an interesting one, because my kids they're still a bit confused about why I'm involved in LGBT in terms of the network and the rights and so on. And they kind of come from a place like, I don't get it. So many of my friends are out, and it's not, no one even considers it an issue. What's the problem? And there's almost a bit of pushback from a young generation who think that the older people are being quite noisy about something where the problem no longer exists. And yet doing what I do, it's really interesting, because I get to speak to people who come to speak to me in confidence, that the hidden side of people that are still trying to deal with it. And some of those people are not, they're not that old. They're still old. I would definitely consider them still young. I mean, grey as you like and as bald as you like. Some of those other people, very much in their sort of 20s and so on, still struggle with it and deal with it, probably because of the reasons that we've talked about before, but also, let's not simplify this. It's a complex subject, and there are lots of different influences that get you to where you might end up. So, yeah, there's a huge amount. There's a huge spectrum still of people that are challenged by and have a challenge with their sexuality, and it's not always about being gay, lesbian. There's a lot of bi in there as well, and increasingly people are talking more and more about trans, and we've had a focus on trans this year within Britvic as well on our Allies Day. Again, trying to help people understand it and understand the language that they use and the impact it will have on people, because it is significant.
Absolutely. And it's also educating enough that those who, aren't in the know, so to speak, or maybe come from a generation where they don't fully understand everything, I think often worry about being vilified for saying or doing the wrong thing. And so what's your take on, the do's, don'ts, the yes, you can say this and yes, you can't say that? Because, and again, there's no right or wrong answer, because I know people often, think differently. And I suppose I always say, well, if it comes from a place of well-meaning and genuine curiosity, then I shouldn't think that there will be, massive pushback on, oh, goodness me, you said this. But I think that's the worry, isn't it?
Yeah, I think you're right. The value's in having the conversation. I think anyone who's not having the conversation because they're worried they're going to say the wrong thing is someone who really needs to have the conversation. Yeah, it plays out. It has to be like that. So I encourage everyone to talk about it. I mean, most people these days have an understanding of what's acceptable. I know you've also mentioned about if it comes from the right place. That's okay to an extent, but you can still use the wrong language that is the wrong language but defend it by saying it's coming from the right place, there's a point where it becomes good enough and not good enough. Do you know what I mean? So if you take it to the extreme, someone could use words that are incendiary, but say it's coming from the right place. But that's different to someone who's a bit nervous about having the conversation because they're not entirely sure about the terminology to use and so on. I think anyone who sits within the D&I community, regardless of where they sit in that D&I community, would much rather have the conversation and get it out there and increase education, understanding and information for everyone involved, rather than not have the conversation at all. And a great example of that is in disability. So I've spoken to a number of people that have significant disability and, for example, wheelchair bound. And a lot of people don't know whether they should get down to the level of someone on a wheelchair, whether they should continue standing and so on and so forth. But most people I've spoken to have kind of said, I don't care, but someone talking to me is going to be a really good start, because so many people actually almost ignore me because I'm in a wheelchair, and I can see they feel awkward. So I think the same follows. You know, if someone's I'm utterly and fabulously out now, so everyone knows, yet I still come out every day, but I become bolder and bolder in doing it in the hope that I'm starting the conversation, if necessary, for people that can find it a bit awkward.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really interesting point in particular, because, you know, again, I've heard this from friends and others on the podcast, you know, oh, I come out every time I go into a board meeting. Do I do it? Do I not? Is there a point? Are we going to end up spending more time speaking about it? But it's interesting that you say that it kind of almost not rolls off the tongue. You know, but I suppose you know, whilst not the same, you know, similar experiences would be talking about, you know, say mental health or adoption or whatever that might be. It just rolls off the tongue and you forget that it's actually a big deal in the you know, in the first place, you know, which is a great place to be in. But just on the point that you made around you know, the example of someone in a wheelchair, you know, I really just want to mention that one again, because it's, you know, it's not being, you know, it's making sure that we know we aren't being ignorant. It is being more ignorant and, you know, almost ruder as well, to completely ignore, you know, that fact of the matter, because, you know, how on earth would that person feel? I mean, we absolutely rather them look you in the eye and have a conversation with you than almost just kind of exclude you. And we all know body language. We can probably recall many instances and where we've been in a room and you kind of just suddenly feel, you know, like you want to shrink back into yourself because, you know, you're, for whatever reason, which you don't know unless that person speaks to you, you know, not worthy enough of being there. So it was a very, very good example, and one that kind of, you know, puts a very stark image into your mind. But I'm conscious of time, Tom, and you know, I could talk to you all day, you know, long about this, and we've really only touched the surface level in many areas. But I wonder, before we head into you know, a brief lightning round, we've just spent a little moment on talking about some of the amazing benefits, because the story that you've described is really been, you know, what I'm sure was an emotional roller coaster. You know, we can see that you really have utilized this superpower almost to benefit back, you know, others, you know, similar experiences, you know, and influence wider society. You know, for those who maybe don't have a Be Proud group or an LGBTQ plus group, or are considering that, talk to me a little bit about some of the kind of other benefits, I guess, or the biggest changes maybe you have seen in some of the people, you know, that you have supported along their personal journeys.
Well, I mean, it's a really big question, because for a couple of reasons. The first is everyone is so different. So we often have these conversations on these top level umbrella terminologies about people, and we almost get to a point where when we're talking about it, we expect everyone fits in the same box, and that's not the case at all. So I have friends, and I have had the pleasure of going on the journey of coming out with a number of other people, some of which are more mature with children, and therefore having that lived experience can really help. But even then, those situations can be completely different, as well as other people that go on completely different journeys from different cultures, where there are completely different expectations and reactions to information and knowledge. So I think it's hard to answer that in totality, because everything is completely different. I guess there's a couple of cliches in there, though. My first observation is and this is purely through an LGBT lens now, that everyone that I've helped or worked with or been on the journey with in their coming out has ended up in a much better place. So there's a period of a trauma. Sometimes that's brought on by the way in which you see yourself and how much of a big deal you turn it into, whereas actually the people you're telling are incredibly loving and open and accepting. It doesn't change that journey. Everyone still goes on that journey. The fear is still very real for all of them. But the relief afterwards, the sense of your own self and the confidence you can have from that has, without question, in my experience, always increased. It's important to note that's not always the case. And my experience is still only a very small portion of the whole of even UK society, let alone globally, right? But largely on balance, people get to a much better place when they're living their true authentic self. And I think it's really hard to do that, really hard to do that. In fact, it is hard to do that. It's not even a question of thinking if you don't live your true life. So know yourself and be true to yourself. They're the cliches, right? But they're just so true. If you haven't got a network, there are loads out there. Seek them out. If this is a conversation you want to have, you are empowered. You have that ability to go and have those conversations in confidence, in groups. There are loads of resources to be able to reach out to. So I'd encourage you to do that. The other thing is it's kind of weird being interviewed as part of a podcast where you're sort of held aloft as a leader and inspirational, and all those kind of words. I think it's really important to realize, and going back to our last conversation, it's okay to make mistakes, whether it be in having the conversation or going on the journey yourself. It's really okay to make mistakes and to pick yourself up again. That is, after all, how we learn the most. So it's a bit about being brave. Do it on your own time. Don't be forced by anyone to speed it up or indeed slow it down. You will know your own situation and what you're facing into, but seek the support because you need the support. And again, Leila, you've talked about how traumatic it was to go through that after being married with children, and it really was very, very difficult at times. I'm no superhero. I've taken the time to seek support as well. I've had the counselling and I've gone through all of that to make sure that I felt supported and gave myself the room to be able to have the thinking time. We're all incredibly busy, and sometimes that's the hardest bit to get to, and it's quite an easy thing to shelve for another day, whereas actually the value is facing into it and trying to understand yourself and deal with that and show up authentically afterwards.
I can see why you're a very good coach, Tom. And I mean, usually I go into a lightning round, but I actually think everything that you've encompassed there is just such a useful, almost collective of knowledge and hope, I think, as well for many others. And so, true to form, I'll do my best to summarize some of the key pieces in this podcast, of which there have been many. My goodness, we've talked about everything from individual journeys through to education, through to language, positive outcomes, seeking support. The last point in particular, I thought resonated a lot with me is having those true allies. And those allies can be people who have similar experience, but they can also be, allies that have different experience. I think, as you mentioned there, the confidential conversations are absolutely critical, where you can let the guard down, so to speak, and really allow others into your circumference and your real vulnerable space, because it is, that support and that knowing that there is someone there for you that can really make such a difference. Another couple of key pieces that really stood out to me, and again, lots of them did, is that the way that you talk about kind of leadership, and I think, Tom, vulnerability as a leader is absolutely key, as you have said. But I'm almost getting from you that actually anyone can be a leader, and that anyone can step up to the plate. Anyone can have a positive impact. And so by providing support, I don't think we need to look these days at leadership as being those white ivory towers of yesteryear. We live in a modern world today, and leadership and people can influence a number of people, and if you influence one person to help them be their true authentic self, then absolutely, hasn't it be worth it?
100%. So true. And I see great leaders at the start of their career who are not senior people in the hierarchy of business, but how they behave and how they show up, awesome. And you can see how they're going to go far very quickly. Equally, I see people who are really quite timid, shy, and held back by their own experiences and therefore how they see themselves. But you're right, it's within everyone's gift.
And how rewarding to watch people on that journey, because this is a journey. This is a living, sleeping, breathing journey. It is a marathon, not a sprint, to coin a well-known cliche, probably term. But it is, it is very, very true. Take your time, as you have said. This is not a rush to kind of suddenly, come out, or all the other aspects of things that we have spoken about. Actually, it is finding that confidence in yourself that ultimately will help you live a better life and experience, I'm sure, far more productive being within that workplace as well. And just finally, the youth and education piece, that was so interesting. I'd love us to do more around that in the future, and maybe even do another podcast on that. I think educating our youth is so critically important. Tom said the repercussions that can have in later years are not to be underestimated. So
Massive unlock.
Lots and lots of learning experiences. Tom, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thank you very much for inviting me. As if on cue.
It's like perfect timing. So, Tom, thank you very, very much for joining me on the Diverse and Inclusive Leaders podcast show today. You've been superb, and I hope that this has positively impacted many people. If you have been affected by anything at all in today's show, please do not hesitate to get in touch. Tom is very friendly, as you've seen. Do reach out to him on LinkedIn or through our community. We'll put into the show notes a number of the key learning points. We'll put a link in there to Tom, so you can reach out as well. And we'll summarize some of the learning points. And you can visit us, download the podcast on Apple, Spotify, your favorite podcast app at www.dalglobal.org/podcast. See you again very soon. Thank you so much for watching the Diverse and Inclusive Leaders podcast. Please do feel free to hit the like button below, or if you'd like to receive future notifications, do ping the notification bell here at the side. If you're interested in the audio version only, you can find it on the following streaming platforms. Any extra info and descriptions will be in the links below. Look forward to seeing you soon.